My name is Nora Callahan. I'm 35 years old, and the sentence that changed everything in my family wasn't whispered in a kitchen or said behind a closed door. It was announced at a dinner table with a tablecloth and centerpieces and a room full of people holding wine glasses. My father looked at my sister's future-in-laws, smiled the way he smiles when he's performing confidence, and said those 5 words about me like I wasn't sitting 4 feet away. She has no future. He laughed when he said it, that short bark he uses when he wants something cruel to sound like a joke. My sister's fiancé's mother set her glass down. She didn't laugh. And 3 days later, on a Friday morning, her husband, a man my father had been quietly trying to impress for months, called my father's bank. Not his cell phone, his bank, the one my father had done business with for 19 years. And the reason that call happened is the reason you're watching this right now. Welcome back to Truth Seekers, where the people who got counted out show the counters exactly what they missed. If someone in your life has ever reduced you to a punchline while you were sitting right there, this story is for you. Drop a comment and tell me what sentence someone said about you that turned out to be the most wrong thing they ever believed. And subscribe, because this one takes a turn nobody in that dining room saw coming. Let me start where it actually begins, which is not at the engagement party. It starts at the kitchen table of a house in Dayton, Ohio, when I was 19 years old, and my father told me that numbers were for men with patience and I should find something I was naturally good at. He said it the way people say things they've already decided, not as a suggestion but as a verdict. He had a coffee mug in one hand and a newspaper in the other. He didn't look up. I had just told him I wanted to study finance. He said it again, slower the second time, the way people repeat themselves to children. Find something you're naturally good at, Nora. He thought he was being kind. That's the thing about dismissal, dressed as advice. It sounds almost gentle on the way in. It takes years to understand what it actually cost you. My father, Dennis Callahan, is 62 years old and has spent most of his adult life managing a mid-sized hardware distribution company he inherited from his own father. Not built, inherited. There's a difference, and he has never once acknowledged it. He runs the company the way a man runs something he didn't have to earn. Loudly, with strong opinions about other people's ambitions, and an almost physical discomfort whenever someone near him does something he didn't predict. My mother, Carol, is the quiet water that flows around whatever Dennis decides. She doesn't agree with him out loud, she just never disagrees. In 34 years of marriage, I have not once heard her finish a sentence. He interrupted. My sister Becca is 4 years younger than me, 21 at the time of this story, 29 now. She is the kind of person who genuinely makes every room warmer, and I say that without bitterness because it's simply true. Becca got our mother's grace and our grandmother's laugh and a certain easy brightness that some people are just born carrying. She was never in competition with me. That was always only my father's project. And then there's me. I left Dayton at 20 with a community college transcript, a savings account I'd built working night shifts at a hotel front desk, and a plan nobody in my house understood or asked about. I found something I was naturally good at. Just not what my father meant. You should know what I was doing for the 6 years before that dinner party, because it's the part my family had decided not to know. At 20, I moved to Columbus. At 22, I passed my Series 65 exam. At 24, I joined a boutique investment advisory firm as a junior analyst. I was the person they put in a room when a client's portfolio was underperforming and nobody wanted to say why. I read numbers the way some people read faces, fast, completely, and with very little patience for what they're pretending to say versus what they actually mean. By the time I was 28, I had been promoted twice, built a client book worth roughly $4 million in managed assets, and quietly started building something on the side that I'll get to. I did not announce any of this to my family. Not because I was hiding it exactly, but because the few times I had mentioned my work, my father had either changed the subject or said something that made the conversation feel like a step backward. So I stopped. You stop feeding what doesn't grow. The last time I'd sat at my parents' table and talked about my actual life, I was 26, and my father had said, and I remember it precisely because I wrote it in a journal that night, "Nora, you know the problem with people in finance? They think moving paper around is the same as building something." He was talking about me in the third person while I was sitting directly across from him. I drove home in silence and didn't bring it up again. For 3 years I answered their questions about my apartment and my health and what I was cooking for dinner, and I said nothing about the work. They filled the silence with what they already believed, and I let them. That was my mistake, or it would have been if the engagement party hadn't happened. The engagement party was Becca's idea, which means it was warm and slightly chaotic, and full of the people she actually loved. She'd been with Thomas Hartley for 2 years. Thomas was a structural engineer from Cincinnati, quiet and careful with his words in the specific way of someone who means every one of them. His parents, Martin and Eleanor Hartley, were coming from Cincinnati. His sister and her husband, a few of their old family friends. On our side it was my parents, both sets of aunts and uncles, a cousin who drove in from Pittsburgh, and me. Becca had picked a restaurant called the Greystone. Private dining room, round tables, the kind of place that has a sommelier on staff and describes the fish as having been locally sourced. My father had suggested it because he knew the owner and thought it would impress the Hartleys. He was already performing before the night even started. I drove down from Columbus on a Saturday and got to the restaurant early enough to check in on Becca before guests arrived. She was in the hallway near the coat check, fixing an earring, and when she saw me, her whole face went up. "You came," she said, and it wasn't dramatic, just true. She'd half expected me to cancel. I hadn't missed anything important to her in 5 years. I told her she looked beautiful, which she did. She told me I looked like I had been living in an office, which I had. We laughed the way sisters laugh when they found their way back to each other after years of quietly drifting, carefully like they're testing ice. The dining room filled in the way those rooms do, in waves of noise and coats and the specific social static of two families meeting for the first time. Martin Hartley was a tall man, with a measured handshake and the eyes of someone who has spent his career evaluating things quietly. Eleanor was elegant in a way that had nothing to do with effort, the kind of composed that comes from decades of being exactly who you are. They were warm to Becca, they were warm to my mother, and when my father introduced himself, I watched Martin listen the way I've watched seasoned clients listen to a pitch they haven't decided about yet. Politely, completely, without committing. My father talked about the hardware company. He talked about revenue, carefully rounded up. He talked about his grandfather, who had started the business, and his own father, who had built it. He used the word legacy 3 times in 4 minutes. Martin nodded and asked good questions and said very little in return. My father interpreted this as deference. I recognized it as assessment. We were 2 hours into dinner, somewhere between the salad and the main course, when it happened. The table had found that particular rhythm of a good meal where the conversation moves easily and nobody's trying too hard. Martin had asked about everyone's work, the way naturally curious people do, moving around the table with genuine attention. He asked Thomas about a bridge project. He asked Eleanor's friend about her school. He'd asked Becca about the marketing position she'd taken in Columbus. Then he looked at me. "And what do you do, Nora?" He said it without preamble. It wasn't small talk. It was actual interest. I opened my mouth, and my father's voice came in from across the table before a single syllable had left mine. He was in the middle of a sip of wine which he set down first, the way men do when they want to signal they have something important to say. "Nora works in finance," he said, and then he smiled. "Investment stuff. She moves money around for people." And then, because he was still performing for the room, because he had decided what this dinner was for, and what his role in it was, he said the rest of it, with the confidence of a man who has never once been questioned by his own family. "Honestly, between us, she has no future in it. Never had the head for real business. You cannot teach instinct." Martin Hartley stopped cutting his food. He didn't say anything. He set his knife down on the plate, slowly. He set his knife down on the plate, slowly, the way you set something down when you're deciding what to do next. Eleanor looked at me. Not at my father. At me. She had the expression of a woman who has heard a particular kind of dismissal before and knows exactly what it costs the person it's aimed at. My cousin from Pittsburgh looked at the breadbasket. My mother looked at her hands. Becca made the smallest sound, barely audible, a pulled breath that I felt more than heard. I didn't look at my father. I looked at my plate, which had a piece of salmon on it that suddenly required my complete attention. I have stood in boardrooms and delivered news that cost clients significant money and kept my face level. I know how to hold still when something lands. I held still. I didn't explain myself. I didn't defend myself. I said nothing, which was either the strongest or the most cowardly thing I could have done, and I've thought about it a lot since. I said nothing because I understood in that specific, crystalline moment that the only person who could change what had just happened in that room was not me. I wasn't going to argue at my sister's engagement dinner, but I was also finished pretending. For 6 years I had let my family hold a version of me that wasn't true, and I had been comfortable with that in the way you're comfortable with a coat that's slightly too small. You forget how much it's constricting you until someone yanks it tighter. My father had yanked it tighter, in front of a room full of people, and something in me simply unlocked. Dinner continued. The main course came out. The conversation moved on, the way conversation does at tables where discomfort has no resolution available in the room. Martin Hartley was quiet for a while. He talked to Thomas and to Becca and asked my cousin about Pittsburgh. Eleanor talked to my mother. My father refilled his wine and told a story about a contractor who had once tried to overbill him on a warehouse renovation, which was his version of a business anecdote. I ate my salmon. And about 40 minutes later, when the table had softened again into dessert and coffee, Martin looked up from the far end of the table and said something quietly that only the people nearest him could have heard. But I was one of them. He said it to his wife, not to the room. The way you say something when you've been sitting with a thought long enough that it finds its own exit. That's Hartley Capital's kind of person, he said. And Eleanor said without hesitation, I know. I didn't know what Hartley Capital was. Not yet. I found out the next morning on Sunday when I drove back to Columbus and sat in my apartment with coffee and a laptop and typed the name. Hartley Capital Partners, Cincinnati. 47 years in operation, private equity and investment management. Assets under management, $2.3 billion. Martin Hartley was not a structural engineer's father who'd done well. He was the founder and retired chairman of one of the largest private investment firms in the state of Ohio. He had stepped down 2 years prior and handed the chairmanship to his son-in-law. Thomas, the structural engineer my sister was marrying, was the Hartley family's quiet one. The one who actually went out and built things while his family built capital. I sat with that for a long time. I thought about the dinner, about my father's voice landing across that table, about Martin setting down his knife, about what Martin had said to Eleanor afterward. I thought about all 6 years I had spent building something, quietly, the way I've learned to build things, without announcing it to anyone who might reduce it to a punchline. I'm going to tell you what I'd built, because it matters to everything that comes next. 3 years earlier, I had started a small, independent, registered investment advisory firm. Just me, a compliance attorney who billed hourly, and a network of clients I had cultivated through 5 years of doing excellent work at someone else's firm. I named it Callahan Advisory Group, which my father had no idea existed. By the time of the engagement dinner, I had 17 clients. Combined assets under my management, $9.4 million. Annual revenue from advisory fees, just under $300,000. I had done this while employed at the larger firm, with their knowledge and blessing, under a conflict of interest waiver they'd agreed to, because my clients didn't overlap with theirs. I had not told my parents any of this, not one number, not one client, not the name of the firm. When my mother asked what I was working on, I said managing portfolios. When my father asked if I'd ever thought about doing something real, I said I was happy where I was. What I was actually doing was building slowly and without fanfare, the kind of thing my father had spent his life believing I wasn't capable of. Monday morning, I drove into the office and did what I always do when something is sitting heavy. I worked. I reviewed 2 client statements, fielded a call about a bond allocation, had a lunch meeting with an attorney who referred clients to me occasionally. I didn't think about the dinner. Not consciously. But there's a thing that happens after a particular kind of wound. It doesn't throb loudly. It just sharpens everything. You see more clearly. Your decisions come faster. The noise clears. By Tuesday, I knew what I was going to do, and it was nothing I planned, nothing I strategized. It was simply that I had stopped being willing to be invisible about something I had bled to build. Tuesday afternoon, I received a LinkedIn message. The name at the top was Martin R. Hartley. The message was 4 sentences. He introduced himself, said he understood we'd met over the weekend, said he understood I was in investment advisory, and asked if I would be open to a call. I stared at it for a moment. Then I sent my calendar link and told him Thursday morning worked well. We spoke for 40 minutes. Martin Hartley talked the way men who have built real things talk, directly, without theater, with genuine curiosity about the specifics. He asked about my client structure, my fee model, my compliance framework. He asked how I'd built my book. I told him the truth. Cold calls in the early years, then referrals, then word of mouth, then patience. He asked about my long-term trajectory. I told him I was looking to bring in a partner and scale to $25 million in assets under management within 18 months. He said that was conservative. I said I knew. He asked why I'd set it low. I told him I only promise what I'm certain of. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said he appreciated that, and then he said he had a reason for calling. One of Hartley Capital's portfolio companies, a mid-size manufacturing firm in Toledo, had recently parted ways with their internal financial advisor. They were looking for an independent advisory relationship, someone outside the family firm structure who could give them clean, unconflicted analysis. They needed someone with a particular combination of skills: investment acumen, operational finance literacy, and the ability to work with a board that was accustomed to strong opinions. He'd asked Thomas about me after the dinner. Thomas had asked Becca. Becca had told him the truth, because Becca had always known the truth. She had known since the first year I was in Columbus. She had just hadn't told our parents because I had asked her not to, and Becca is, above everything, someone who keeps her word. Martin had also done his own research. He named the larger firm I'd worked at, the compliance structure of my registered advisory firm, and one client relationship I had developed independently that had apparently been discussed in a context he wouldn't share, but said spoke well for my judgment. He asked if I'd be interested in a meeting in Cincinnati to discuss the engagement as a potential client. I said yes. Then I sat very quietly for several minutes after we hung up. On Friday morning, Martin Hartley called the bank. Not my father's cell phone. The commercial lending department of the regional bank that had handled my father's business accounts for 19 years. I found out about this secondhand, through a chain that started with my Aunt Sandra, who is my father's sister, and the one person in the family my father actually tells things to. My Aunt Sandra called my cousin from Pittsburgh, who called me because my cousin and I have always had the kind of relationship where we tell each other things no one else knows. The story, as my cousin relayed it, went like this. My father's company, Callahan Hardware Distribution, had been in the process of renewing a commercial line of credit. Routine for a company their size, something they'd done every few years. My father had submitted the renewal paperwork in October, and it had been moving through the bank's process without issue. On Friday morning, the bank's commercial lending officer called my father's office to let him know that the renewal had been flagged for an additional review. The flagging wasn't punitive. It was a standard secondary review, triggered by a cross-check against a reference the bank had independently sourced. The bank, doing its due diligence on the Callahan business renewal, had reached out to Hartley Capital Partners as part of a regional commercial network they participated in. Martin Hartley, in the ordinary course of providing that reference, had mentioned that he was in early discussions with a Callahan Advisory Group, run by a Nora Callahan, in connection with a significant advisory engagement. The lending officer, being thorough, had asked for clarification on whether Callahan Advisory Group had any formal relationship with Callahan Hardware Distribution. It did not. They were entirely separate entities. But the officer had now noted in the file that the Callahan family appeared to include an active financial services business that the bank wasn't currently working with, which triggered a relationship review about whether the bank should be serving both entities. The lending officer called my father to inform him of the flag and to ask, as a courtesy, whether he'd like the bank to reach out to me to discuss consolidating the relationship. My father, who had not been aware that his daughter ran a registered investment advisory firm with $9 million in assets and a pending engagement with one of Ohio's largest private equity families, had no idea what to say. My Aunt Sandra said he sat in his office for the better part of an hour afterward and didn't take any calls. When my mother asked him at dinner what was wrong, he said nothing and refilled his glass twice. I want to be honest about something here because I think it matters. I did not engineer any of this. I didn't call Martin. I didn't tip off the bank. I didn't choreograph a reveal. The only thing I did was answer Martin's call. Honestly, schedule a meeting in Cincinnati and tell him the truth about what I'd built. Every consequence that followed was the natural outcome of the world finally having accurate information about me. That's the part my family would eventually struggle with most. They couldn't point to a scheme. There was nothing to be outraged at. The thing they'd spent years dismissing had simply kept growing while they weren't paying attention. And eventually it grew tall enough that someone else saw it over the fence. My father called me on Saturday morning. I was at my kitchen counter with coffee and a client report I was reviewing. I let it ring once, then picked up. He didn't say hello. He said my name the way you say a word when you're trying to decide what tense to use. Nora. Just that. I said good morning. There was a pause, the kind that has weather in it, and then he said, "Your mother tells me you have a company." I said I do. Another pause. He asked how long. I told him 3 years. I heard him breathe out. He said the bank called him. I said I know. He asked why I had not told him. And here's the thing. That question had been sitting in my chest for 6 years, and now he was asking it, and the version of me that had sat quietly at that dinner table 4 days earlier would have softened the answer, would have said she wasn't sure, would have been careful, would have managed his feelings the way I'd been managing them. My whole adult life. I didn't do that. I told him the truth. I told him I had not told him, because the last time I had shared something about my work, he had told me I didn't have the head for real business. I told him I had not told him because he had said, in front of Thomas's parents and my sister, and everyone else at that table, that I had no future. I told him those things quietly, without heat, because it was just the truth, and the truth doesn't need volume. He didn't say anything for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was different, smaller, somehow. He said he didn't remember saying that at the dinner. I told him I did. That was the whole conversation. He said he had to go and hung up. I sat with my coffee and finished reading the client report. The Cincinnati meeting happened the following Thursday. I drove down in the morning, arrived at Hartley Capital Partners offices in a building on 5th Street that had the particular heft of an institution that has been exactly what it says it is for a very long time. Martin's assistant met me in the lobby. Upstairs, the conference room had floor-to-ceiling windows and a long mahogany table, and the kind of light that makes you feel like you should be precise about everything. Martin was already there, and with him were 2 people from the Toledo Portfolio Company, their chief financial officer, and a board member who had flown in from Detroit. We spent 2 hours going through their current financial structure, their near-term capital needs, and what an independent advisory engagement would look like in practice. I had prepared a proposal, 12 pages, specific and documented. The CFO asked the kind of questions that tell you whether someone is doing their homework or their theater, and I gave the kind of answers that made the distinction clear. At the end of the meeting, Martin walked me out to the elevator himself, which I suspected he did not do for everyone. He said the board would be in touch. Then he stopped, his hand on the elevator button, and said something I wasn't expecting. He said he had looked up more about my father's company after the dinner, Not because he was looking for something, he said, but because he was trying to understand the context. He said he'd spent 40 years working with people who built things and people who inherited them. And he'd learned to tell the difference immediately by the way they talked about other people's work. He said what my father had said at the dinner was the single most clarifying thing about him he could have heard. Then the elevator opened and he shook my hand and said he looked forward to working together. I rode down 17 floors in a wood-paneled elevator and stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the cold November air, which is a thing I do when something has happened that I need to carry carefully. The Toledo engagement was signed 6 weeks later. Annual advisory fee, $84,000, the largest single client my firm had ever taken on. I didn't call my father to tell him. I updated my firm's website with a general note about expanded services and operational finance. My cousin from Pittsburgh saw it and texted me a string of exclamation points. I sent back a single thumbs up. That's still the whole exchange. Before I tell you about Becca's call, I want to stop here and ask you something directly. Because if you've made it this far in this story, you might be the exact person I'm about to describe. Have you ever been reduced to a shorthand version of yourself by someone who was supposed to know the full version? Not by a stranger, by the people who were in the room when you were learning to walk, when you were figuring out who you were. The people who had every possible chance to ask. I spent 6 years in the same city as my parents, 4 hours down the interstate, 6 years during which I took 14 client calls before 8 a.m. because that was when my clients could talk. 6 years during which I filed compliance paperwork and built a book and turned down 2 acquisition offers from larger firms because I believed in the thing I was building and wanted to see it through. 6 years during which my father asked me at Thanksgiving whether I had thought about taking the real estate exam because his friend Gary had a daughter who was doing well in real estate. 6 years of that. And here's the part that is more complicated than it appears. I am not entirely without fault in this. I made a choice. I decided not to tell them. Not because I was playing a long game or waiting for the perfect reveal. I decided not to tell them because I have learned, slowly and painfully, that sharing something real about my life with my father meant watching him do one of 2 things. He would minimize it, the way he'd minimized everything from my college scholarship to my first promotion, with a line like, "That's nice, Nora," before pivoting to something about the hardware company. Or he would co-opt it, find some way to locate himself in the center of my accomplishment, tell people at church that his daughter was doing well in finance because she'd inherited her grandfather's head for numbers, which was a story about him wearing the costume of a story about me either way. The thing I'd shared came back to me smaller than when I'd offered it. So I stopped offering. And then I kept building. Quietly and completely and in the silence they'd made available. The problem with that strategy, the thing I hadn't fully anticipated, was that silence reads as emptiness to the people who want you to be empty. When I didn't tell them what I was doing, they filled the space with what they already believed. And then they said it out loud. Proudly. In front of people. Like they were being generous by lowering expectations on my behalf. That's the thing I needed you to understand before I tell you what came next. Subscribe if you want the full picture, because what happened between me and Becca after Cincinnati is the part that mattered most to me personally, even though it's not the part that moved money. It was a Sunday evening, and I was cooking, which is the only time I'm ever fully off the clock. She asked if I had a few minutes. I turned the heat down. Becca has never been someone who needs a preamble for difficult things, which is one of the reasons I trust her the way I do. She said she had talked to Thomas's mother. She said Eleanor Hartley had told Thomas that the meeting in Cincinnati had gone very well and that his parents thought I was exceptional, and that Eleanor had specifically said she wished she had known at the engagement dinner so she could have told our father to his face how wrong he was. Becca was quiet for a moment after that. Then she said she needed to tell me something she'd been carrying since the dinner. She said she had known for years what I had been doing. She said when I had asked her not to tell her parents, she had not once. She said she'd kept it because she'd thought eventually they would ask. Eventually they would be curious enough to find out on their own. She said she'd been waiting for them to ask. And the dinner had finally shown her they never would, not on their own, not about me, not unless something made them. She was crying a little by then, the steady kind, not the performed kind. I told her I wasn't angry at her for keeping the secret. I told her she'd done what I had asked. She said she was angry at herself for not doing more. I said some lessons take a long time to arrive, and the timing isn't always ours. She laughed through the tears, at that, which was a good sound. She said Thomas wanted me to know that he thought I was remarkable. I said to tell him he chose well. She said she already had. The thing about revelation in a family is that it doesn't end cleanly. It doesn't tie up. The room doesn't applaud, and the person who was wrong doesn't transform overnight into someone who knows how to say they were wrong. My father sent me an email 2 weeks after our phone call. It was 6 sentences, formal in a way that told me he'd rewritten it several times. He said he had looked up my firm. He said he had not understood the scope of what I was doing. He said he regretted what he had said at the dinner. He said he hoped we could have dinner sometime. He signed it with his first name, which he has never once done in the 20 years I have been an adult. I read it 3 times. I did not respond immediately. I sat with it for 4 days, not to be cold, but because I needed to understand what the response should actually be. On the 5th day I wrote back. I said I appreciated the email. I said I accepted the apology for the dinner, because words said in a room full of people, and a sentence like that said in a room full of people, costs something, and I wasn't going to pretend it hadn't. I said I would have dinner with him, but I wanted it to be honest dinner, not the kind where we agreed not to mention what happened, and moved on in the comfortable silence we'd been in for 6 years. I said, if we were going to have a real relationship, it would require him to be curious about my actual life, rather than comfortable with the version of me he'd already decided. He wrote back in an hour. He said he could do that. He said he would try. I don't know yet if he will. Some things take longer than a letter, but the door is open, which is more than it was the night he said I had no future. My mother called the week of Becca's actual wedding, which was in March. She called on a Tuesday afternoon while I was between client calls, and the conversation was the kind that only happens once in a family. She didn't start with the engagement dinner, or my father's email, or the Hartley contract. She started with a story I had never heard. She told me that when she was 24, before she married my father, she had applied to a graduate program in accounting. She had gotten in. She had deferred once, planning to go the following year. My father had proposed that same fall. She had turned down the enrollment. She said she had never told anyone that, not my father, not her own sisters. She said she had watched me leave Dayton at 20 with a binder full of plans and a resolve she recognized from somewhere, and that watching me go had been the most complicated thing she had ever felt. She said she was proud of me in a way she hadn't known how to say, because saying it out loud would have required her to also say what she had given up. I listened to all of this on a Tuesday afternoon in my Columbus office, with the door closed and the phone pressed against my ear. Then I told her that I had known, since I was about 16, that she had given up something large. Not the specifics. Just the shape of it. The way she could run a household's complete financial picture in her head and never once had anywhere to put that. The way she looked at my reports the few times I'd left them on the counter, quickly, before my father noticed. She cried then, for real, not the polished kind, the kind that's been waiting a long time for permission. I told her it wasn't too late to do something with those numbers. She said she was 61. I told her Ruth Bader Ginsburg was appointed to the Supreme Court at 60. She laughed, which was the right sound. We talked for 40 minutes. It was the longest real conversation we'd had since I was a child. It ended with her asking if she could visit me in Columbus. I said, "Please do." She said she'd ask your father. I told her she didn't have to ask anyone. She was quiet for a second. Then she said she'd check her calendar. I want to tell you one more thing about the week after the Cincinnati meeting, because it's not dramatic, and it matters precisely because it isn't. I drove back to Columbus on a Thursday evening and walked into my apartment and put my bag down and stood in the kitchen for a moment. The city was doing its usual thing outside the window, the particular low hum of a mid-size American city at 6 in the evening. Traffic and distance, and the smell of cold coming through a window I had left cracked that morning. I made dinner. A simple thing. Pasta with whatever was left in the pantry, the kind of meal you make when your brain is still running files in the background, and you need your hands to do something straightforward. I thought about the conference room with the mahogany table. I thought about Martin setting down his knife at dinner. I thought about my father's voice saying no future, and about the way that sentence had traveled across 6 years of my life and arrived in a room with $2.3 billion in it and been immediately, quietly, and entirely disproved. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be clear about that, because people always expect the triumphant part to feel large. What I actually felt was tired and something close to relief. The specific relief of no longer having to carry a secret that had been getting heavier for 3 years. I had built Callahan Advisory Group in the margins. Early mornings before the day job started, Saturday afternoons when other people were at brunch, client calls in parking garages between meetings. I had filed compliance documents at 11 at night and reviewed portfolio reports at 5 in the morning. I had done all of this without telling anyone except Becca and my compliance attorney and Priya, who had been the firm's first hire and who had figured out within her first month what she'd walked into and responded by working harder than anyone I had ever asked to keep up with me. Princess Priya was 26 when I hired her. She'd come out of a regional bank's investment team and had the look of someone who had been underestimated recently and was quietly building the case against it. I recognized it immediately because I had been wearing that face for years. She'd asked me, at the end of her second week, why I kept the firm so private. I told her I didn't think it was private exactly, just quiet. She said there was a difference. I said I was aware. She said she'd figured that out. That was the whole conversation. She was already on her third client file. I looked at her and thought, this is what it looks like when you let someone capable just work without putting conditions on their ceiling. I had made a decision then that I would never do to Priya what my father had done to me. Would never limit her by the size of my own imagination about what she could become. That's the thing about being dismissed by the people closest to you. If you survive it and come out intact, you become pathologically incapable of doing it to the people around you, which, in the long run, turns out to make you a better builder than the people who were never dismissed at all. Here's the concrete thing. 3 months after the engagement dinner, my firm had taken on 2 additional clients referred by the Hartley network. Assets under management had crossed 14 million. I had brought on a junior analyst, a woman named Priya, who was 26 and the sharpest person I had hired, and she was already doing work I would have been proud to have done at her age. The Toledo engagement had expanded in scope to include a quarterly board presentation. Martin Hartley had personally introduced me at a regional investment conference in February, with a single sentence that I will remember in the specific way you remember a sentence that corrects years of something. This is Nora Callahan. She is someone you want advising you. My father attended Becca's wedding in a charcoal suit and spent most of the cocktail hour talking to Martin Hartley. I don't know what they talked about. Becca told me later that when my father had introduced himself as Nora's father, Martin had said in front of 3 other people that he was a lucky man. My father had apparently said, "Thank you," in the specific deflated way of someone who has just realized that being called lucky is not the compliment they were hoping for. At the reception, my father found me near the bar and asked if he could have 10 minutes. We walked to a corner of the room that was away from the dance floor. He looked like a man who had been practicing something and was now confronting the gap between the rehearsal and the actual event. He said he had been wrong. Not just about the dinner, though he said the dinner specifically, by name, with the tablecloth and the wine and the precise sentence he had said. He said he had been wrong about me for a long time, and that he understood now that wrong isn't something you fix with one good letter. He said he had spent the past 3 months looking at things differently. He had looked up the investment advisory licensing requirements, the assets under management thresholds, the regulatory framework my firm operated under. He had wanted to understand what I'd actually built so that when he said he had misjudged it, he knew precisely what he had misjudged. He said the number 9.4 million had stopped him cold. Not because it was large, but because I had done it alone in silence, while he had been telling people I had no future. He stopped there. His jaw worked. He said he didn't know how to ask for what he was asking for, which was the chance to see clearly from here forward. I looked at my father for a moment, the 62-year-old man, with the inherited company, and the loud opinions, and the 30-year habit of being the authority in every room he entered. And I saw underneath all of it something I had not let myself look for in a long time. The actual man. Not the performance of the man. Someone who had spent his whole life afraid that the people around him might build something he couldn't take credit for, and who had only just, in his 60s, begun to understand what that fear had cost him. I didn't forgive him in that corner of the room while the band played. That's not how real things work. But I told him I had heard him. I told him I would call him on Sunday. And I told him that if he wanted to understand my actual work, he could start by asking me a question about it, and then listening to the entire answer without telling me what he thought of it beforehand. He said he could do that. He asked me to start. I told him about a bond ladder strategy I had been building for a client approaching retirement. Nothing fancy, just the real detail of the work, the kind of specific I had never once offered him before because I had never believed he would receive it. He listened. He asked a question. It was a good question, not the question of a man who understood the mechanics, but the question of someone who was genuinely trying to. I answered it. We stood there for 20 minutes while the wedding reception moved around us. And my father asked me about my work with an attention he had never once offered me in 35 years. It wasn't redemption, but it was the beginning of something that might in time become honest. And honest is something I'll take over any performance of warmth. There's one thing I haven't told you yet, because I was saving it. Not for effect, but because I needed to get to it in the right order, and the right order is after the wedding reception corner with my father. After all of that, my grandmother, my mother's mother, her name was Dot, passed away when I was 27. She had lived in a small house in Kettering, Ohio, with a vegetable garden and a wind chime that sounded like an argument between metal and weather every time there was a breeze. She was 81 when she died, and sharp, until the last few weeks, the kind of sharp that makes a doctor pause when they ask orientation questions, because she answers them too fast. I had been closer to her than to anyone else in the family. She used to call me on Sunday evenings when I was getting started in Columbus. The early years when the apartment had a radiator that sounded like someone trapped inside the wall and the Vangean light that came on every third Tuesday without apparent reason. She would call and ask about the work, the real work, the specific numbers and clients and decisions, and she would listen all the way to the end of what I was saying before she said anything back. That kind of listening is rarer than money. She had told me once when I was in my early 20s and still in the phase of trying to make my father understand what I was doing, that some people receive information about you, and some people only receive confirmation of what they already decided. She had said, "Stop trying to inform your father. He isn't receiving." I had thought at the time that was a hard thing to say about her son-in-law. I understand now that it was the most accurate and merciful thing she could have offered. When she passed, she left me something. Not money, though there was a modest amount of that too, divided evenly among the grandchildren. What she left me specifically was a letter. Her handwriting, which had been architectural in its precision even at 81, in an envelope that had been sealed and given to the attorney before she went into the hospital. The final time, the letter was 3 pages. I'm not going to share all of it, because some things are yours and shouldn't be anyone else's. But she wrote one paragraph near the end that I have read so many times the paper has gone soft along the fold lines. She wrote that she had watched me build my life with the same patience she'd watched her own father build his slowly, without announcing, without needing the room to understand what was happening until it was already done. She wrote that quiet building was the most powerful kind, because it compounded without interference. She wrote that she was proud of me in the specific way a person is proud of someone they recognize. And then she wrote this, and this is the part I keep. Don't let them name you. You named yourself already. They'll catch up or they won't. But either way the name stands. I read that letter for the first time in the parking lot of the attorney's office on a Wednesday afternoon. I read it again that Sunday. I've read it probably 40 times since. It's in the top drawer of my desk at the office, which means it's the first thing I touch every morning when I sit down to work. My grandmother died without ever seeing the Hartley contract or the $14 million in managed assets or the junior analyst I hired or any of it. But she had watched me leave Dayton at 20 and had made a precise bet on what that leaving meant, and she had put it in writing because she wanted me to have it after she was gone. That's the inheritance that made everything else possible, not the money, the letter, the specific, documented belief of one clear-eyed person who had decided I was worth watching and then watched. Here is the only thing I'll tell you. The one thing I keep coming back to when I think about the engagement dinner and the Friday call and the Cincinnati meeting and the wedding reception corner, the sentence my father said about me was not a reflection of me. It was a reflection of a limit he had set inside himself. A line past which he decided no one near him should be allowed to go without his approval. People like that do not say you have no future because they have accurate information about your future. They say it because your potential makes them feel the size of their own ceiling. For years I had let that sentence land in me the way a weight lands. I had built my life underneath it, quietly pressing up from below. And the strange thing, the thing nobody tells you about building something real without anyone watching, is that eventually it gets heavy enough to be seen whether you lift it or not. My father said I had no future. He said it in front of a table full of people with wine in their glasses. And what happened by Friday is that the future he said I didn't have called his bank, not to embarrass him, not to settle a score. Just because it had gotten big enough that it was simply there, occupying its own space in the world, requiring no introduction and no defense. That's the lesson, and it's the only one I'll leave you with. Build quietly, build honestly, build without waiting for anyone's permission or their recognition, because the people who withhold recognition are usually the ones with the least capacity to grant it anyway. And eventually, if you build long enough and well enough, the thing you built will introduce itself. You won't have to say a word. That's my story. A dinner table sentence, a Friday phone call, and 9 years of building something in the space where a person's future was supposed to not exist. If this story reminded you that the people who count you out are usually counting wrong, share it with someone who needs to hear that today. Drop a comment. Hit subscribe. And I'll see you in the next one.